The concept of debt has existed in human society for millennia. Humans have used debt for a variety of purposes, such as to fund projects or to fund personal goals, such as to build a house or to build a business. Individuals are not the only things that can acquire debt. Corporations can acquire debts. Other groups, such as governments, can acquire debt. Governments also spend on a much larger scale than humans. So their debt can range in the billions instead of the thousands, for instance. The creditors of their debt then are large corporations or groups or even other countries. Now, the relationship of countries in relation to one country holding debt over another country is a relationship that has existed for a very long time. But this video will cover several important anecdotes of that relationship in the 20th and the 21st century. It will compare the relationship of debt and how countries handled debt in both centuries, and will see if there are any takeaways that individuals and countries can learn from this analysis. In the 20th century, several major events happened. Notably, there were 2 world wars. This brings us to the first anecdote, being the post-war period. The post-war period was a period in which Europe was financially and societally devastated. Its infrastructure was gone. It had no capacity to earn income. However, it retained a lot of its pre-war and war-acquired debt. Now, the creditors of this debt either were in the same boat as them, such as Britain, or were not, such as the US. But the creditors recognized that many of these countries, especially Germany, for instance, would not be able to pay off their debts for a long time, and that harassing the country for its debt could only lead to further hate and malice between the two countries and could lead to further tensions. Instead, such as with Germany, the UK and the US decided to not make Germany pay off all of its debts. It decided to forego the payment of certain debts in exchange for a friendlier relationship and the ability for the country to recover economically, in the hopes that a strong, economically sound Germany would be more beneficial to American and British interests than an angry, economically devastated Germany would. And this gamble on the part of the English and the Americans worked, as Germany essentially suffered an economic miracle, in part due to the forgiveness of the debts by the UK and by the US. And Germany emerged, while initially debt-ridden, as one of the strongest economic forces in Europe and the world, and remains so to this day. So that was an example of how debt can be malleable, and countries can use debt as a token to be fulfilled or not to be filled, but either way to promote good relations between two entities. The second important event of note in the relation of debt during the 20th century was in the post-colonial period. During this period, many countries who were formerly colonial possessions of the European motherland countries, so these could include countries located in modern-day Africa or South America or the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, or not Europe, but Asia or the Pacific. These countries would be heavily subjugated and exploited by the European countries, but also debt would be acquired in these colonies' names. However, the question emerged, when these countries became independent, did they retain the debt acquired by the colonies? One argument was yes. This was the same territorial entity, was composed of mostly the same peoples. In a sense, they should retain the debt because they are the continuation of that original debt obligator. Another perspective was no. These are completely different countries. They are independent for a reason, because they felt that the original colony was not what they are now, and that they are not the original colony. And in that sense, they take on none of the debts of that original colony, which is considered a separate entity to them. This was a bit of a quagmire that debtors and these countries wrangled with. But many newly independent countries in the end decided to take on some of the debt and to pay off a lot of that debt. This was to show that they were financially responsible, because these new countries wanted economic investment, and the investors were looking for safe investments. And to show that you were a safe investment, it was beneficial to show that you were wise with money and that you were willing to pay off debts acquired, so that you were not going to cheat any potential investors out of their money. So in the end, debt here was used as a trust building tool to hopefully improve the standings of these newly independent countries. The 21st century saw two distinct groups emerge in relation to debt: the developed countries, primarily in North America and Europe, and the developing countries, primarily in Africa and Asia. First, in the developed countries, these countries often possessed essentially too much debt. Their debt to GDP ratios were so high, GDP being the gross domestic product, the amount of capital a country produces in a year. Their debt to GDP ratios grew so high that they were not able to pay off their debts, and their debts would continue to increase. This had a huge strain on their financial systems and led to many of these countries collapsing, the most notorious of which being the Greek financial collapse of the 2010s. As a result, these countries suffered economically, with lost jobs and lost investment opportunities. This was a blow to these countries. They acquired so much debt because of many reasons. A prominent one was that these developed countries often had very comprehensive social security nets. And these social security programs required the funding to come through debt. These countries would acquire debt in order to invest in their social security programs, and eventually the debt became too much as these countries continued to grow. This has been the trend so far for developed countries, but something very inverse has occurred in developing countries. Developing countries have the opposite problem. They have not had the opportunity to acquire enough debt. This has occurred for a variety of reasons. The developing countries are much more likely to have corrupt government structures. They are unreliable acquirers of debt. Investors do not see these countries as being able to pay them back, because the leaders will not give them their money back, or they will spend it inefficiently, or even that the data coming out of these countries is just not accurate. The data reporting of these countries is often inflated or misleading in order to trick investors into investing in their country. And as a result, investors are very wary to lend money to these countries in which they have very little guarantee of getting the money back. They would rather invest in developed countries, which is why the developed countries have acquired so much debt, because investors are so much more willing to spend. But the developing countries are not able to acquire opportunities to show that they are capable managers of debt, and they are able to pay back their debtors. Unfortunately for them, in the instances when they are able to acquire debt, often they do not pay the creditors back, and they default on their loans, which further reinforces in the investors' minds that these countries are not reliable investments. So the developing countries, as a result, have suffered from worse living conditions due to reduced investment. Now, the developed countries then, in the 20th century were often the war-torn countries of Europe. These countries were showered with debt forgiveness and the opportunity to rebuild. As they continue to develop, they often continue to acquire debt, perhaps under the impression that it would not be so bad as in the past they had been forgived. But now it has been shown that the countries will acquire too much debt and that a financial collapse may result from that. So many countries who have not experienced such a financial collapse may have still experienced a very high debt to GDP ratio and will continue to experience economic hardships as a result of that high debt to GDP ratio in the future. Developing countries have often been the newly independent countries who now have not had the opportunity to acquire debt because they have not been seen as reliable, despite maybe their best efforts in the 20th century following their independence. These countries are just not receiving the funds they need to continue to operate and to grow and develop and maybe transition from a developing country to a developed country. There are several takeaways from this. Developed countries should be wary of taking on debt. If they have not experienced an economic collapse and they still suffer from a high debt to GDP ratio, they should work to manage their debt in ways that pays it off as quickly as possible to potentially avoid an oncoming economic collapse. Developing countries should take hard but necessary steps to ensure that they are trustworthy. This may mean changes in government or changes in the way that they run their country. Do anything to show to the potential investors that you are credible. Take extra steps to ensure that, yes, this country is safe for investment. We will pay back your loans as promptly as possible, and you will be rewarded for your investment in this country. But in the current moment, they're not doing that. So that is a key takeaway that developing countries must learn in order to grow into the rest of the 20th century. Overall, debt affects countries in many different ways, and it affects the way they manage their relationships with other countries. Hopefully, this informative video shows you as an individual how you may influence, how your opinions and your choices in government will influence how your country deals with its debts. And as countries, hopefully this video can allow you to manage your debt in a way more consistently and more beneficially to your future. Thank you.